In this exercise, I want to take a walk through the CSS file that we've been using to create the main page of worrisome.com. Now, it's important to remember that not only are CSS files read by computers, but they also have to be read by people, particularly people that are perhaps editing somebody else's work, or they are the same author coming back to a CSS file after a few months or a few weeks of doing a project. So what I wanted to do with this particular example is to step through all of the different aspects of this CSS file so that when you open it up in your own editor, you might understand a little bit more about some of the nuances that have gone into creating it. So the first thing that I want to talk about is how we use CSS comments. And comments are particularly useful when we want to just add little notations, perhaps as reminders to ourselves or to other people as to what a particular style, rule or declaration does. So here I'm using a CSS comment, which is denoted with the slash and the star at both ends, just to remind me that the style sheet is wrapped in a media rule, which will hide it from, in this particular case, Internet Explorer for Macintosh. But we can also use CSS comments to help with searching CSS files for particular rules. And here, above each style, I'm actually adding in the name of the rule, prefixed by an equals sign. And this means that when I'm searching, I can just do a search for equals HTML or equals H3. And that means that it's very easy for the search facility to jump to that particular point. Whereas if I just called it H1, then there may be multiple H1s on the page, perhaps in different places. And this helps me jump directly to the top of that particular block of CSS. The other thing it's important to do is to look at minimizing the amount of CSS that we can use. And although CSS files are downloaded once and then cached by the browser, they still should be as optimized and as small in file size as possible. So I begin my CSS files by defining as many global rules as possible. And here I'm using the star, or the universal selector, which will remove margin and padding from every element on the page, unless I override it specifically further on down the style sheet. This means that I don't have to use margin 0 and padding 0 anywhere else in the CSS file until I decide that I need to perhaps have a different padding or margin for a different element. And here I've got a range of grouped selectors, starting with H2 and ending in OL, or ordered list, where I'm using a specific margin padding declaration which has been added to all of those selectors. I also like to start at the top of the document, so I start by working on the root element, followed by the body, and then moving down in semantic order. So here I'm defining a universal rule for all of my headers, which I've set to have this font weight bold and text transform uppercase. Down below, I'm then able to work specifically on other headers, perhaps H2 or H3, and add other styles such as font sizing or colours, just for those particular elements. Now, it's often discussed amongst designers as to how to order a CSS file, and whether or not it's best to break up your CSS file by element or break up the file based on where the element exists on the page. So, for example, my preference is to group all rules for H3s, for example, together. So no matter where they may appear in the document, I'm setting rules for H3. So just to show you here, I have a global rule for the H3 element, but it may be underneath that I have my div content main H3, where I will put my styles, and then underneath that I may do the same thing for the content subdiv. Other people may argue that it's best actually to have an area of the style sheet which contains all of the CSS for content main, whether they be headers, paragraphs, lists, images, anything that's going to go inside there. And then another area for the elements which sit inside content sub. Again, there's no right way or wrong way of doing this, but I personally find it much easier to be able to go directly to an area of the style sheet where we have all of the declarations and all of the rules for H3, rather than having to scan up and down a style sheet trying to find where it may be. And particularly with some of the CSS that I do, the style sheets can get pretty long. Now, we're going to talk in the next movie about how we work with multiple style sheets and be able to organize them. But before we do that, let's just start this time at the bottom. And we can see that all of these rules here have been grouped by their element. Now, it's also important to remember that we can use CSS shorthand properties to minimize the amount of CSS that we need to write. So, for example, here on this form with the ID of search input, we're combining all the background properties into one declaration. For example, the path to the image, followed by its repeat property, and then its position. So it's important to use shorthand as much as possible to squeeze every byte out of the CSS file.
This is one of the reasons that people have started to use this particular style where one rule follows the other on the same line. In the earlier days of CSS, and still with many CSS developers and designers, you see each individual declaration on a separate line and lots of white space and indentation and things of that nature. In very heavy document management situations, this can really, really be costly because that bandwidth can be expensive. And if you're managing tremendous amounts of documents with a lot of visitors to your site, like maybe your AOL or Yahoo or something like that, that actually can translate by shrinking down these documents, both the XHTML and the CSS documents. That can actually translate into millions of dollars of savings a year for these companies. So it's a very fascinating little piece of not only workflow and best practices, but what ends up being a return on investment for the companies involved.
Now, in the examples that we've been working with on this title, we've used a combination of layout for the CSS. So on our main CSS file here, we have all of the rules on one line. But within some of the examples, we've been breaking it up onto multiple lines to ensure that it's a little bit more readable for the demonstrations. So once again, it's important to remember that there is no right way or wrong way of organizing a CSS document. What's important is to keep in mind making the document readable and as efficient and as small as possible.